Welcome to Advanced Passion, the show where I invite a guest to evangelize me about something they are deeply passionate about. It could be absolutely anything at all, really. A movie, a band, a book, some food, a place, a person, a concept, an idea. I don't know. We've had all sorts of stuff on this show over the episodes. Today, I am very excited about our guest. My name is Ben Jack, and I am joined today by Justin Brierley. Justin, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Ben. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you.
A delight to have you on. Now, Justin is the host of the Unbelievable Show. It's a radio show and a podcast. Links in the description below. And of course, while you're there, why not go and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of these great conversations? Leave us a like and leave a question. And you're definitely going to want to leave a question in the comment section, because Justin's show is all about dealing with the big questions of faith, getting people together. But you will describe your show far better than I will, Justin. Why don't you tell us a bit about the show, a bit about yourself, and your wider role at Premier?
Yeah. So the show is Unbelievable, and with a question mark, and it's been going for 16 years now, believe it or not.
Wow.
So it started as a radio show, a couple of years in became a podcast, and really it's from its inception it's been about bringing different perspectives together for dialogue and debate, and that's very often Christians and non-Christians. In fact, you've been on the podcast, Ben, doing a great interaction with sort of an ex-Christian. So there's we've done all kinds of issues over the years. We range far and wide: ethics, philosophy, history, science, and it's sort of gradually grown. So having been something that was really aimed at Christians in a way, to model what those kinds of conversations would look like for our Christian listenership on Premier Christian Radio. Once we started podcasting, suddenly started picking up a lot of non-Christians who were tuning in, wanting to hear these interactions. And then in more recent years, we've had a lot of video content as well, going out via YouTube. Began our big conversation video series as well, where we teamed up with the Templeton Foundation, who were able to inject a bit of investment in it so that we could bring some really big names on and get our sort of video side of things going. And we've had some, super interesting conversations with big thinkers like, Jordan Peterson and Daniel Dennett and, Sir Roger Penrose and people like that, on the non-Christian side, and, some great names, Professor John Lennox and N.T. Wright and others responding. But it's been for me a huge journey, as I've sort of really got, I suppose, learned an awful lot in the process myself. I was very, green, wet behind the ears when I began the whole thing, and it's been a real lesson in learning about apologetics, evangelism, theology along the way, and it's grown in all these different ways. We have a conference now, so this year's coming up on Saturday the 14th of May in London, back to our first in-person event in a couple of years, though we're still absolutely. I'm looking forward to that, seeing people.
Tell us a bit more about that, actually. Tell us more about the conference, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people listening and watching who will definitely want to get tickets for that.
Well, it's sort of, as I say, it's our first back in person, because we're doing it live from the British Library in London, which is exciting.
Wow.
But we had a huge number of people turn up for our first fully online conference last year, when we were still sort of in lockdown effectively. And so we're trying to do the hybrid thing, best of both. So you can attend from anywhere in the world online, as well as if you want to come in person. And so we've got our theme is God Unmuted. So we're kind of playing on the whole, we're all used to muting and unmuting ourselves on Zoom these days, but it feels a lot like with, the culture we're in, it's become very divided, very confused. There's a lot of, the culture wars going on, and Christians often, I think, feel like nervous about what they can say and should say, or how to speak basically with truth and grace into what are often, highly charged kind of environments, especially on social media and places like that. So we're really we're really going to be concentrating on how to do that, how to speak, in the world that we're living in today, to take God off mute, as it were. And we've got some great guests joining us for that. So Alistair McGrath, who we do a lot with through our C.S. Lewis podcast, is going to be one of our guests. Lisa Fields, who does some brilliant work with the African American Church in the US, is one of our guests. We've got Sharon Dirks, Glenn Scrivener, Bishop Joseph D'Souza from India is going to be contributing, Sky Jatani and Phil Vischer from the Holy Post podcast in the US, and other guests.
Great.
capping it all off with one of our live big conversation events as well, which will be really interesting. We've got Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who's become a very interesting and influential psychologist. He's the author of a very influential book called The Master and His Emissary. And he's going to be in a discussion with Sharon Dirks, who's a Christian neuroscientist by background, talking about, is there basically a master behind the mind, basically.
Right.
So I'm really looking forward to it. It's going to be a really interesting day. There's lots of ticket options. In fact, you can pay what you want. There's one option when it comes to the online side. So we just want anyone who's interested in, wanting to be able to speak more confidently, live out their faith more fully in today's world, to go along and find out more. So the website is unbelievable.live if you want to find out more about it.
Please do. We'll put a link in the description below, and do go. And if you choose the pay what you want option, I want to encourage people to be super generous. This is the kind of stuff that we should be investing into to help to prepare us and equip us, not to just have arguments with people, not even really to be necessarily better equipped for answering people's questions in and of itself, but it's a way actually of us fulfilling the Great Commission and loving people and showing the love of God to people, to say, I'm going to take your questions seriously, not so that I can win an argument, so that I can actually show you that God's love is so profound and meaningful, that is meaningful enough to me to put the effort in to help you on your journey, and hey, me to learn and grow as well. So be super generous in giving if you can. Get yourself along to it. And you're about to launch a whole suite of resources and kind of go to the next phase really with the Unbelievable ministry.
Yeah, it's very exciting because we are about to launch in a kind of new way from the conference onwards, Premier Unbelievable, which up to now most people know primarily as the show that I host, but we have been adding additional podcasts and videos to that. We've in the last few years we started a regular podcast with N.T. Wright, who's a well-known Bible scholar. Ask N.T. Wright Anything. We just in the last year started a C.S. Lewis podcast with Alistair McGrath. But we've got more podcasts coming, more video resources coming. We're starting a regular monthly webinars, live shows effectively, and live Q&As where people can really just learn from some of the best voices out there and a diverse range of voices. We've got more training events and online training courses as well. We launched our first one at the end of last year called Confident Christianity, where we just we're trying to help people basically to find ways that are good for them, where they can just go online, kind of do a Udemy style teaching learning course and just be equipped for how to answer some of those difficult questions, present their faith more confidently. So the whole thing is, it's not rocket science, but all we're trying to do is engage skeptics with, and encourage them to explore faith, and then help Christians to understand their faith, defend their faith, but share their faith ultimately with confidence. That's the end game that we're looking for with the launch of this new ministry.
Beautiful. Now, Justin, before we get into your passion, which is the main theme of today's podcast, I wanted to say that we should talk about your book as well. Like your book is a resource that is currently available. Absolutely, and we love to give a shout out to books on this channel, because if we're shouting out someone else's book, it means that I can't self-indulge in shouting out my own. So so Justin, tell us about Unbelievable, the book.
So the book, it's been out for a few years actually. So and it was probably around the 10-year mark of the show that I decided it would be interesting to write a book, because a lot of people asked me, after having so many atheists and agnostics on your show over the years, why do you still believe, Justin? Why haven't you been talked out of Christianity at this point? And so I thought, well, I felt kind of confident at that point, the sort of 10-year mark, to sort of say, well, I've been thinking this through, and I think there is a really credible case for Christianity. And so I've tried to basically put that in the book, why it's kind of my long form answer to someone who'd ask, what's the reason for the, hope that you have. And that's it really. It tells the story of the show as well, or up to the point where I wrote the book, the story of the show. And it's just hopefully a way of drawing people into the kind of the reasons for why Christianity makes sense, answering some of the obvious big objections that are out there, but also making that case for us to do it with gentleness and respect, hopefully modeling kind of what we've been talking about with, being open to people and not seeing this as a sort of an argument to be won, but actually about people who are loved by God and who you can have as your friends and, you know, have
absolutely
conversations with.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this show is very much about thinking creatively and sometimes a little bit out of the box about what our evangelistic witness into the world looks like, what our personal evangelism looks like, and trying to think about the human experience, listening well to the world around us, thinking about what the connection points are. And I know this is a huge part of what your ministry is about, and certainly the heart behind apologetics should always be that, listening carefully and then responding carefully as well. I think your role as moderator is a fascinating one, and I'm in awe often when I'm watching the show and I see how you moderate these discussions, and I think to myself, I could not do what you're doing because I would want to be engaging too much. I'd want to be jumping in and speaking. You got two guests there, differing positions, sometimes two Christians with different theological views, or excuse me, perhaps a Christian and atheist is debating something, and you're sitting there, and you clearly have a position. Even if it's two Christians, you're going to sit on one side of the theological fence. What I find fascinating in light of creative evangelism is the role that you take being in and of itself evangelistic, even while you're not necessarily always the primary contributor. You're there to help the contributors to do what they need to do, but obviously you're guiding, you're leading. I'm sure there's challenges sometimes in thinking about how much airtime you give to one view and the other, make sure it's as balanced as it can be, and it's always incredibly fair. And I think that's why non-Christians in particular feel very comfortable coming on the program, because I think they know it's going to be fair, which is a beautiful thing. But just creatively, in terms of evangelism, I find that as a wonderful opportunity that you're demonstrating as to even what some just gentle evangelism can look like in terms of your posture and your willingness to not just barrel in or not just take the side of the Christian, but to actually moderate. How do you see moderation fitting into the world of evangelism? Because I think that's a fascinating thing.
Well, and it's so kind of you to say all that in the first place, remember. But I think you're onto something there. I think it's I do regard it as an absolute gift, and something that I guard very carefully, that I've been given this amazing opportunity to represent Christ to lots of non-Christians who listen into the show, who watch the show and everything else. And as you say, I can't do that by sort of constantly being the person who presents the case, because I'm there really to just bring two people together, and they will, do the presenting. And I think it's sort of almost about having the confidence to allow people to say their piece without feeling like I have to weigh in and sort of come back on that. And even in the, where maybe, I've certainly been in plenty of positions where when the Christian's been sort of doing an answer to something, I thought, oh, I wouldn't do it that way, or I would have said it differently, or I would have done a better job, maybe, But you kind of have to just, I have to accept, look, I'm here to do a certain job, and that is to bring these two together. And I've, in good faith, I need to let that conversation play out the way it plays out without trying to, gerrymander it in any way. And
right.
And that's in a way what makes the show interesting in a way anyway, is because people come into it without there being some kind of pat answer. You're hearing a genuine kind of dialogue between people who, and you just see what you get on the day, and where the cards will fall is where they fall. But I, as the moderator, for anyone who, becomes a regular listener, especially, or viewer, I'm kind of the constant. The other guests will change from week to week, but I'm the person in the middle who is so there's a sense in which I'm not too worried about exactly how a conversation plays out. I mean, I want the Christian to do well, obviously, and I want the atheist to feel like they've had a good, chance to put their case and everything else. But I'm more concerned that I if the person that most listeners and viewers are seeing or hearing from week to week is me, that I am actually presenting myself well, and not coming across as wanting to sort of make things work out just the way I want them to, and that I'm kind of comfortable doing that. And that's, as I say, where the confidence comes in, that I can hear and be part of a conversation where someone's making trenchant criticisms of the Christian faith, making a cogent case against it maybe, but where I'm not sort of going, oh my goodness, I need to shut this guy down, this is too hot, but where I'm like, okay, tell me more, explain. And because in my experience, I found that there's always answers. I might not have them immediately to hand, and my guests may, my Christian guests may not have them immediately to hand. But actually, when you take the time to look into it and research and find out things, you'll always find there's always two sides to every story, every criticism, or whatever it is. And I suppose I just trust that God's there in the process, and that people are reading more than just the intellectual arguments that are going on, but they're kind of wondering, oh, where's Justin in the midst of all this? What's his opinion? And I mean, one of the best compliments I sometimes have of the show actually is when people have got in touch to say, oh, it took me a few, there may be a new listener, and they say, oh, it took me a few weeks to realize you're actually a Christian, Justin, because I'm right. And that's because they think, oh, he's not nailing his colors to the mast in these conversations. He's letting both sides talk it out and so on. Now, obviously, it becomes fairly obvious once you hear me, talking in other scenarios or doing the feedback, maybe where I do a little bit more response to people who are asking questions directly, that I am a Christian. But it's something about just not having the confidence to hear people's criticisms and not sort of have a knee-jerk fear response, but just to say, okay, I hear you, and that's an interesting point, and let's talk about that, and let's and I think that just sort of takes the wind out of the sails almost a bit of a lot of maybe skeptics who think Christians they just can't handle the truth, they can't handle it's not the case. There's lot, and I think it's about showing that even if you don't have an immediate answer to every objection that's out there, actually in the long run, I think the show has proven that there's a really strong intellectual core to Christianity, and that I'm here just to sort of shepherd those conversations and then let people make their own mind up at the end of the day. But my hope is that if I can be a kind of representative that does conduct those conversations and encourage others to conduct the conversations with grace and truth, and doing it with gentleness and respect, that itself can speak just as loudly as the arguments can very often over the course of time. And that's been a real joy to see that there have been people for whom just listening to the show, not so much the arguments necessarily, but just listening to the show has changed their opinion of Christianity. They've got more respect for it because they feel like, oh, okay, no, they are willing to listen. They are willing to sort of have genuine conversations and dialogues about this stuff without, it just being a sort of, because there are other apologetic shows and there's no harm in these, but where it's more kind of a question comes in and then it's just a Christian answering it. Yeah. But there's no kind of pushback. And that's the big difference, I think. And that's why I think it has drawn that audience that is both Christian and non-Christian ultimately to the podcast.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful. I encourage people to go and watch the show anyway. But as you're going and watching the show, just do pay attention to what Justin's doing and how he's operating, because I think you will learn a lot about gentle witness. And you said something there which I thought is great evangelistic advice in any situation, which is trust God in the process. And very often in our evangelism, we can all too easily not do that, not trust. We trust our method more than we trust God in the process. We trust our clever answer. We trust our tried and tested gospel presentation or something like that. And there's nothing wrong with those things in and of themselves, but they're not going to save anybody. Only God can do that. So trust God in the process is very important. And I'm also really drawn to this idea of clarity. It's one of the things I talk about the most in evangelism training and equipping with people is clarity. Like, our number one priority in evangelism is to have clarity over the gospel. If we're not clear about the gospel, we're going to come unstuck really quickly. So we've got to be clear about the gospel, and then that will enable us to be clear in everything else that we're doing in our lives, in our response to God personally, but then as we become witnesses for him into the world. And I think that one of the things that comes across very clearly in the Unbelievable shows is that clarity doesn't always come from just good articulation. Sometimes clarity comes from, again, trusting God in the process and just letting things come out slightly in the wash, which doesn't mean that we're not clear about what we believe, and it doesn't mean that we don't try our hardest to communicate with clarity, succinctness, whatever else we need, wisdom, certainly, to give people clear, good answers to the questions that they have. But I think there's a clarity. This sounds a little bit sycophantic, but I think there's a clarity that you bring just through modeling a light touch with the moderation. And I think there's a lot for us to learn about. I mean, we've spent half the podcast already not talking about your passion and talking about this, but I think it's so worth talking about because it's something that often doesn't get talked about, that clarity doesn't just come from opening our mouths. Clarity can also come from the posture of our heart and the way that we actually demonstrate the gospel,
Yeah.
So thank you for that. That's really helpful.
It's my pleasure. And as I say, I'm in the very fortunate position of having this kind of regular point at which, for many people, I it's a weekly thing that they will hear my voice. And so it's an extraordinary privilege to do that. And so to that extent, I'm so glad that you feel, Ben, that I do bring that kind of that sort of lightness of touch, as you say, to hopefully, because that's ultimately what I want to do. I want people to I want people to not just hear good arguments on the show. I want them to hopefully feel like they've engaged with a different view of Christianity. So many people who come to the show, especially if they're non-Christians and skeptics, they've maybe been turned off by church, or they have a picture of the church that is basically informed by a very kind of skewed media profile of this terrible organization that just is out to be anti-gay and do terrible things. And sometimes their only genuine encounter with kind of Christianity in a sense is actually just listening to my show. And to that extent, I don't want it just to be a debate. I want it to be something where you might hear something and feel something that's actually a bit more like what Christianity really is about it. Because ultimately, what I do on the show is a very tiny part of what the big scheme of Christianity is about. Christianity has never been about having debates and arguments with each other. Now, that might feature, but ultimately I want people to be introduced to a church which is about grace and which is about the extraordinary things that we can do in Jesus' name. And so when I get the opportunity to kind of just smuggle in almost that aspect, I think it just helps people to kind of, it starts to people change their caricature of what Christianity is, and even if they've come for the kind of the back and forth with the Christian and atheist, my hope is if they stick with us, they'll see something different in the end.
Definitely. Now the show format's gone completely out the window, but that's fine.
Yeah,
No, it's not your fault. It's my bad moderation, as opposed to your good moderation. So, but it's all good. Let's get to the passion. Now we could have talked about TikTok today, because I know you're passionate about that. We had a great conversation with York Moore about TikTok just the other week. Do go and listen to that podcast and find out a bit more. Maybe we'll circle around to some of that stuff, because I think it's probably all connected and relevant to a degree. But what are you going to evangelize me about today? What is your passion, Justin?
I'm going to try and persuade you to become a fan of U2, like I am.
Okay. Okay, you wouldn't be the first, actually, to be honest. Many people in my life seem to love U2, so give me both barrels.
I've loved U2 really since my early teens, and in a way, I wasn't into music at the time they were really coming through in the 1980s or anything like that. But so I bumped into their music in more like the mid 90s and late 90s. But I quickly got their back catalogue and everything. And I was a Christian, so that there was, to some extent, it was natural that I kind of sensed the kind of the spiritual sort of influence on their songs. But it was really the music that I loved. I loved the Edge's chiming guitars. I loved the kind of passion that Bono brought to it. I just loved the melodies and the sense and that kind of anthemic kind of quality to it. And when I finally, more as an adult, got to see them in concert, it was just a semi-transcendent experience, to be there and to see the art and the craft that's gone into this, and the quality of the production, this most extraordinary video sort of presentation alongside the music that was going on. And I think, just on a purely, if you were just looking at it just at the level of the influence this band has had, the extraordinary longevity, the way they've been able to reinvent themselves over the decades, they have to rank as one of the best, even if you don't like their music, they have to rank as just one of the best bands out there in terms of just the way they've been consistently extraordinarily popular, the way they've not just remained as a sort of, post-punk 80s band, from Ireland, but become this kind of world, that had this ability to capture the minds and imaginations of people all over the world. And on top of all that, I just find that their music is, to me at least, and this is a highly subjective thing, but for me, it speaks very powerfully to me. There's something about the way the lyrics and the music and the atmosphere that's generated. It takes me out of the now and points my thoughts somewhere in the direction of heaven. It feels like I'm being reminded that I'm part of something much bigger than myself. Often with lots of types of U2 songs, they just lift me out of myself and frankly, and this is the Christian side of me talking here, they cause me to praise, they cause me to worship and wonder.
Wow.
And so for me, that is why I'm a big fan of U2 and why I think you should be as well, Ben.
Well, we'll get into my journey with U2 as we go, but I'm interested to dig a little bit more into the kind of spiritual mindset that the music puts you into. Is that a lyrical thing, or is it a musical thing, or is it a combination of both?
I think it's definitely a combination of both, because there's a sense in which whatever it is, whatever formula they've devised, U2 with many of their songs over the years have just developed this sort of this ability to kind of make something feel really grand, and those kinds of songs which kind of people like Coldplay seem to know how to write as well, which just give you that sort of sense of something bigger than yourself, that in that kind of, which when you put it into that stadium kind of feel, suddenly it's like everyone's having a semi-religious experience when they're in that moment. So there's something about it. It is definitely a combination, I'd say. And whereas, a lot of bands, to some extent, you listen to the average Oasis song, the lyrics don't really make much sense at all when you actually listen to them, though they kind of invoke something and a feeling or whatever. But with a U2 song, I genuinely find there's a lot of meaning that's been encapsulated in the lyrics themselves, and that's in a way a little bit of a gold mine, because I think most people don't think that much. Most people who just listen to a song for the first time or on the radio or whatever, the lyrics are often, I think, very secondary to the tune, to the melody, to the feeling it gives you. But when you actually go digging, it's what C.S. Lewis termed as sneaking past the watchful dragons of our whatever it was, awareness, that there's a lot of spirituality that's just been snuck in there, and people won't realize just how deep that sometimes goes, I think. So that's why I think they're very powerful in that way.
I hadn't had much exposure to U2 as a teenager, but 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, I joined Youth for Christ and did a year with them, traveling around the country and doing outreach in various different environments. My team leader was a humongous U2 fan, and that was my first exposure as a kind of 18-year-old to really, I knew who U2 were, I just never really listened to the music. I was a DJ growing up, so I was much more interested in the bumpty dance music than the rock and roll stuff. And I started listening to music. I was like, I get it. I get it. And then we went to Ireland on one particular trip, and we ended up going to the school where the Edge's children were going. And I remember just having this incredibly awkward encounter with the school chaplain, as my team leader just went, crazy over that. Oh, so the Edge, these kids are going to be there. Oh, wow. So what do you call him on Parents' Day? Is it like Mr. Edge, or like, she's like, I call him by his name, and it was just really awkward. But, we've all had that moment, haven't we, where we have someone that we revere and we love. And maybe we come vaguely into their circle and we think, there's actually possibly a tangibility there for us that we could, we were like, what we're normally like 10 steps removed from that person. But on this occasion, I'm like one step removed. And I remember having a conversation with him afterwards, and I was like, why are you so like into U2? And why is it just a celebrity? Have you just got a celebrity crush on Bono and the Edge? And he made us drive to Bono's house and sit outside it as like a pilgrimage. It's like, why are you so? And he was very similar to you. For him, it was a love of the music, but also a feeling that this music had actually helped his spirituality and his connectivity to Jesus grow. And so it was this unique bonding of, a little bit of celebrity awe, but actually a deep level of bonding to spiritual experience. And we get that in so many different ways. I do wonder, though, in our current age, where we're increasingly being encouraged to divorce ourselves from spirituality, we're thinking about the mental realities that we live in, but not the spiritual realities that we live in, that actually where it can be quite useful to have people that inspire us spiritually, like you two, it can become increasingly unhelpful to have people in our lives that just become a point of idolatry almost, for people. And what do you think the difference is between somebody that we look at and think, wow, there's a real spiritual dynamic there, and somebody where we look at it and it's just actually a bit of an unhelpful celebrity crush?
Yeah, well, that's it. And I think that is the great danger, and I think social media and everything has only served to heighten that. And the problem is that so often, especially in our media, the personalities get focused on rather than the thing that they are famous really for doing, which is creating music or film or whatever it might be. And so
I heard it said once that this is the famous for nothing generation.
Exactly.
Famous for being famous.
Yeah, totally. And that's it. So there is a kind of banality in that. Now, I think, there are people though who have kind of earned the respect that they're due because they have created something, quite unique and extraordinary. I think, easily Bono and U2 and that would fall into that category. And I don't particularly see them. In fact, I'd say you rarely actually see them kind of courting publicity just as a band or as individuals. Obviously Bono has frequently stepped into the limelight primarily for causes that he's concerned about. Now, I know that he's earned himself a bit of a reputation, which actually he very much sort of, plays tongue in cheek himself of being sort of a self-appointed messiah of the world or something. But I think I've got a lot of respect actually for them. I mean, they're not perfect. No one is. And, to some extent, I'm genuinely less interested in the band. I don't have a lot of memorabilia or, sort of first editions or whatever, of anything like that. I genuinely just enjoy the music, and sort of, I find that it does that for me. And, as so often with music, I think you end up sort of taking away what you want to take away from it, and whatever Bono's original intentions were in a particular lyric or line, it's sort of secondary almost to me, as to because you kind of make your own associations, don't you, with this stuff. So I think in the end, it's just about sort of separating the artist from the art to some extent, and being able to appreciate the one without kind of getting obsessed about the other. And I think unfortunately that is the way the media likes to direct people. But like I say, I mean, in a very tiny, small way, I've sort of had something, grown something of a following on social media and through the show and everything else. I don't want that to be about me. I want it to be about the ideas, about the concepts, and that I'm not particularly interested in people discussing what does Justin, do or believe or eat for breakfast. I'm kind of far more interested in hopefully just start sending them off on a conversation, on a discussion that is about the actual concepts that we're talking about on the show or on my TikTok channel or whatever it might be. So yeah, hopefully that's the place, ideally we concentrate our thoughts and efforts.
I've just got visions now of some Youth for Christ worker, some young Youth for Christ worker now going to the school where your kids are at and saying, "Oh wow, this is Justin Brierley." These kids go here, wow, amazing! And let's drive to his house and have a look. And so hopefully not for you, Justin. Hopefully not. No. I think it's really interesting that we struggle to with this kind of disconnection between the art and the artist, and we can end up getting more interested in the artist than the art, and the kind of complications around that, especially when we think that ironically it's often the other way around with God. We can get very interested in the effects of God. We can get interested in the things that are put on, the festivals, the worship music, all of which are good things in and of themselves. but they're not the primary thing. And actually, when it comes to our relationship with God, it is to be the other way around. Rather than the art being the main thing, it is the creator, and it's the art that points us to the creator. And where do you think some of the disconnect with that comes again? So we have this kind of equal and opposite problem. We're obsessed in culture with the person, and the art is secondary. But when it comes to God, we can be very obsessed with the effects of. And
well, I think, and we've had our own, we have sadly, a celebrity culture thing in the church. We know that, and we've seen some very sad instances in which people who have been part of that celebrity culture have had very public falls from grace in recent years.
For sure.
And I think that's a huge wake up call to the church about, okay, what are we pointing people to? Are we pointing people towards some big ministry or individual or, uber cool, successful church or whatever it is, and saying this is what we're aspiring to, and this is the way in which we will draw people, or kind of if you took that away, would you still be left with something that's attractive? Can we make our that little church with just a handful of people, can the community and the spirit and the life that is there actually be just as attractive as the one with all the celebrity pastor with the sneakers and the lights and the smoke machine? Because I'm not sort of saying you mustn't have all that and down with all of this modern church business.
Sure.
Because I think there is a place for for genuine creativity and kind of excellence and being able to engage people in these ways. But the danger is always when you kind of believe your own hype and you think this is the next big thing. I am the next great communicator of the Christian faith. And as soon as you've done that, I think the end is spelled out for you, because it's almost like, for me, as soon as the focus tilts away from Jesus, then you've kind of lost the end game. It's sort of so I think it's really difficult. Christians just have to be really careful and wise about the way they engage the culture, so that they're doing it in relevant ways, absolutely, and they're and everything, but they're not buying into that celebrity culture that basically just idolizes people and successful things and ministries and whatever, and just sort of tries to take the best of that, kind of in the way that the Booths did. When the Salvation Army began, they saw things that were they took the pub songs and they took the things that they knew would engage their culture, but they never let it, they used it very specifically to point back to Jesus. And that's, for me, is what we're trying to do in our day and age, isn't it, as well, so that we don't get captured by the culture, but somehow we we can use the culture to point back to Jesus in that way.
And I think there's a lot of people that, I say a lot, I don't know how many, but I think some Christians who would look at a band like U2 and feel like they've missed an opportunity to be more forthright in expressing Christian faith, more forthright in the lyrics of the songs, more forthright perhaps in interviews at times, or it seems that Bono or the band in general are going through seasons where they seem sometimes a little bit more leaning towards the faith thing, and then other times leaning away from it. What responsibility does a band like U2 have to be a representation of the gospel on behalf of the church? And what point are we actually just looking for somebody else to do what we often aren't doing ourselves?
That's it. I think that's the thing. I think the problem is, you see, if U2 had from the outset kind of seen themselves as a quote unquote Christian evangelistic band, they wouldn't be U2. They wouldn't be what they are. And I think they've always been aware of that. And I think, and it's always been a sort of a, for the nerdy U2 Christians out there, guessing game as to, where's Bono at with his faith and where's the Edge? Right. And, we know that one of them probably isn't a Christian, and all of this business. And to some extent, it's sort of, I think probably quite wisely, they haven't sort of put that front and center, precisely because, there is then that danger that if you set yourself up as, some paragon of, I am, a spokesperson for Christianity in the church, you immediately then get shot down, either by people on one side or the other for whom you're not going to be good enough in one way or another. So I think they've let the music speak for itself, and to some extent, and the art and everything they've done around it, I think they've done it, at a personal level, I'm sure, with their own faith kind of informing that and how that works, but kind of probably very specifically not wanting to make it too over and obvious and sort of evangelistic in the sense that they're trying to create in a way a background to people's lives that could then be, there might be a conduit, something that from a song or an experience or whatever that leads them, who knows, towards faith, toward Jesus, but where they're more kind of, I think, doing that sort of almost pre-evangelism thing of simply waking people up to the kind of transcendent nature of life, and that there's a sort of a reality beyond yourself. And the reality is, as soon as you start preaching that overtly in a stadium or something, the problem is you break the spell almost, and because it becomes something more like a sales pitch. And I think my guess is that they've just never seen themselves as that's not their job. Their job is to, as far as their Christian faith of Bono and Edge and whoever does motivate what they do, it's to sort of give it's to tell a bigger picture, a bigger story. And then others who maybe do have the gifts like you do and I do to some extent, in our own particular spheres, might then take it to the next level and start talking about you two on a podcast and why it all leads back to God or whatever. For me though, when I was starting to, you two felt like a gift to me when I was a teenager, trying to start to, in my own very awkward ways, talk to my friends about Jesus, because I'd had this amazing experience of feeling like I'd met Jesus in a powerful way. But if I just started talking about what happened in my church, it would all just been weird and strange and kind of like, but then I was able to say, oh yeah, you like that song. Yeah, I like that song too. And oh, do you know, actually, that lyric where he talks about, you carried the cross and my shame. Did you know what he's talking about there? And in just that simple way, suddenly I had a kind of way of my friend going, oh, I didn't realize that. Oh yeah, now you mention it.
Yeah.
And it was, at that age, it was just something that was really helpful, just in a very simple way, to kind of a connection point, that where something that someone else recognized and took seriously, I was able to say, oh yeah, well, funnily enough, that makes sense to me for this reason, So yeah, who knows what those conversations ended up in, but I was glad to be able to have at least that cultural touch point, as a teenager when I was starting to have those conversations.
Yeah, no doubt. Very precious and powerful. And again, as we're looking around the things that are in our world today culturally, it's always good for us to just be thinking about what are people engaging with, and what do I like? What am I interested in? And we have more opportunities for that than we've ever had before, because there's so much media produced now that people are engaging with, and people want to have conversations about these things. And when there's little very, obviously there's the song that you just referenced there has a very direct connection point, but even indirect connection points can be used to turn ordinary conversations into extraordinary gospel opportunities. And I think you mentioned pre-evangelism. I think arguably we've never had a time when pre-evangelism is more useful to us. I think we've had many times throughout history where just hitting the gospel full on the head, bang, in every situation is pretty much a straightforward way to go. No messing about. Just tell people what it is. But I think over the last kind of 20, 30 years, we've seen the power of pre-evangelism, opening up dialogue. And also, I've been talking about this recently, that the difference between sharing faith and sharing the gospel, and how we conflate those two unhelpfully at times. And there is a difference. Sharing faith is opening up testimony, and pre-evangelism, connecting people's experiences to my experiences or to other experiences, gentle connections to the Bible. But obviously, sharing the gospel has a very specific set of parameters. It's about sharing the tenets and precepts of the good news in the power of the Spirit, that people might come to know those tenets to be true. But often people will struggle to apply those or accept those tenets, particularly because there's some bad news to wade through before we can get to the good news, unless there's been that pre-evangelistic bridge building and stuff. So those things need to be working in synergy. And I think that's probably true now. I mean, maybe there's been other periods in history as well, but from what I can see, it's probably more true now than it's ever been before. So being wise with our connection points is so essential. But along the way, sometimes people won't understand what we're doing, particularly in the church. I think sometimes people, not to be disparaging to the church in any way, shape, or form, it's just, I think, wise to recognize that sometimes along the way, if you're out there having a go, trying to make connection points, there will be times when people, they don't get it, they're not on board with it, and you'll face criticism. And I think one thing that you and you two probably do have in common is that you probably both faced criticism. You two for not being Christian enough at times, maybe even sometimes being too Christian at times. I imagine you, Justin, have faced some criticisms at times. I'm not looking for an inside scoop on the worst criticism you received, but more just how do you go about coping with some of the criticism that comes your way, particularly when it feels a little bit unjust, particularly when it feels like people just aren't quite up to speed with what you're trying to do in the wisdom of the kingdom?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. That in a way the show is quite unique because it's quite diverse, and to that extent, I will feature a variety of people on it, a variety of theological views very often. Now, it tends to sort of be centered, on a kind of a mere Christianity sort of, where at least one of the guests will hold to a sort of orthodox, let's say, position on most issues. But there's kind of going to be times when the subject matter makes sense, that I maybe have. Sometimes I've had shows where I don't even have a Christian on necessarily. I've got someone who's more kind of sympathetic to faith. Like, one of the best shows I recorded was a big conversation between Tom Holland and AC Grayling, where they were debating the history, and whether Christianity gave us our values. Now, Tom Holland, doesn't espouse a sort of a faith himself necessarily, but he was the right person to be debating that issue with AC Grayling for that particular show. And if there was a, specific Christian on board, it was me. But in a sense, it wasn't the kind of a show where, there had to be a sort of a faith represented for the show to work. There are other shows, such as the one you've done, where, you need someone who, does embrace Christianity to be able to do it. And so if there are criticisms, they're sometimes in the area of, did you get the right Christian on to do that issue? Did you, and that's just a factor of the fact that that's just a reality of the fact that, there are diverse theological views on there. And
sure,
if it's this particular issue and I get this particular person kind of representing the Christian side, if you like, they might do it a different way to someone if I got, the Calvinist on, or the Arminian on, or the whoever, so you inevitably, I think to some extent though, people, I don't honestly feel like I get masses of criticism on that front, because I think people just accept that it's a show where we kind of do, put out a diversity of Christian viewpoints on areas where I think there is a sort of justifiably different perspectives on different issues. And that in the totality of what we put out, you will hear from a variety of different kind of Christian traditions and perspectives. So to that extent, I think people, to some extent, people just got used to the fact that that's the way the show operates, and we don't sort of, it's not as though I never ask someone who comes on my show to sign a statement of faith or something like that. That wouldn't feel right in this context. Now, there are some contexts where if you're doing ministry, you might, that might be an appropriate thing to do. But for this, it's sort of, I'm willing to kind of be myself, the sort of, I know where I stand on Christianity, but I'm kind of happy to kind of, for there to be a sort of a variety of different perspectives that will come in different ways on the show, and on a variety of different issues. So to that degree, that I when it comes to criticism, I tend to, as long as I feel comfortable that we're kind of doing what God's asking us to do, that there's a sense in which we're fulfilling what this particular show is about, which is creating that space for those kinds of conversations. I'm, as you said earlier, I do trust that God is involved in that process, and that it's not just about, who I've selected to bring on the show or my perspective on it, when I'm moderating it, but that God's working in the background and bringing the right people in at the right times, and speaking to people in ways that I can't probably imagine through the show, and so and just praying that God will do what God does, in the background, and that the fruits will come out of that in the end. rather than trying to sort of feel like I have to have a very specific dynamic, theological position every time on the show or something like that to get that effect.
Basically what you're saying is we peaked too soon on the podcast. 10 minutes in, we came up with the line of the episode and we could have wrapped it up then. Trust God in the process. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
But it is true. It is true, it's true of anything, like you were saying earlier. There's only so much you can do to sort of, put things in place and make sure that, a certain outcome happens. In the end, you can't control people. The wind blows where it will, and it's like that with the Spirit. You have to kind of let God do the rest and just trust and pray that God's working there, that even if something's felt like a complete disaster to you, you just don't know what God might actually end up doing with it, and that's the way God works.
We're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to finish by, I guess, circling back around to you two a little bit, but bringing it all together with what we've been talking about today. You spend a lot of time talking to people who don't yet know Jesus. We pray that they will, but you also spend time talking to believers of differing opinions. But I'm interested in kind of having conversations with believers who are thinking about sharing their faith, but they haven't kind of totally figured out how to do that. They may be making music like you two, or they're making movies, or they've started out in podcasting and been inspired by you, and they've started out doing podcasting apologetics. But along the road, you have access to that person, and you just think, I'm really thankful that you're doing what you're doing, but I do see some areas where maybe there could be some development, maybe there could be some change, maybe you could be a bit more explicit sometimes, or maybe you're being too belligerent, and you just need to that process of helping people to journey. How do we do that well? If you had access to you two in those early days, how would you have got alongside Bono and encouraged him, mate? Like, God loves you. Your performance is not affected by, or your performance doesn't affect how much God loves you. But maybe there are things that you could think about one way or the other. What would your advice be to people that are listening about how we can encourage each other to think about our offering of witness into the world?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, if you're going to offer advice, make sure you really know the thing that you're offering advice about, and that you've genuinely engaged with that thing that person is doing. If they are creating podcasts, make sure you've listened to a good number of them, and you've got a real sense of what they're doing. And if you think you've got the expertise or something that might be helpful, I'm always open to what I would call constructive criticism. I do by no means think that I have created the perfect podcast. I think there's many things that could be improved, all the time. And we make little tweaks here and there as we go along. And I'm always wanting to hear, someone the other day got in touch and said, Justin, the other day I heard you say about 7 times in a row the word, in when I was describing. And I was like, yeah, I do that. I have some, I still, after 16 years of doing this show, have some verbal crutches that sometimes manifest themselves when I obviously don't know what the next thing is I need to say. But equally, I can take that and listen to it, because very often it's people who are getting in touch are also saying, but I'm so encouraged by this aspect of what you do, even if they've got some suggestions. And I think that's just so important to encourage people with the things they're doing well, to acknowledge that, and to and to be alongside them with that. And then where you think there's a way in which something could be done better, or there's an emphasis needs adding somewhere, to do it, I suppose, again, with gentleness and respect, so that you're not sort of slamming that, that person's, the way they're doing things, but you're helping them, as someone else who wants ultimately the same outcome. So that yeah, as to what I'd say to Bono, I don't know. I'd probably be like your youth leader, just be like, oh, I'm overcome in the presence of teenage Bono. I don't know. It's so difficult, isn't it? Because when you're at any point that someone's developing something, they're usually doing it out of a passion for doing it, and they don't necessarily have some 50-year game plan in mind, but they're just doing what feels right in that moment. And often if you're further down the line, you have got helpful things to offer, but you don't want to sort of squash or kind of over organize what someone's doing, because they might just be doing it differently to you, and they might actually end up doing it in a way that works for them and, you know, captures a whole new audience, you know. I mean, case in point, my at the time 16-year-old son got me into TikTok about a year or more, just over a year ago. And I was very skeptical about the whole TikTok thing. I just thought it was teenagers doing silly dances. And but he kind of showed me, he'd done quite a lot of research and kind of trial and error himself. He'd started his own TikTok channel. He was doing all right, had several thousand subscribers. And he showed me, Dad, I think the things you say in the book, that could work on TikTok, but you need to do this, 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 and this. And I was like, oh, okay, all right, I'll give it a go. And he took me through it, and it was a bit of time we had sort of just after Christmas and before the return to work in the new year. And I thought, we spent a couple of days just working on a couple of these TikTok things. And to my entire surprise, they did really well. And it was purely down to my 16-year-old teaching an old dog some new tricks. And I realized I've been a bit sort of sniffy about this whole area and thinking, oh, you know, you can't do anything serious on TikTok because you have to have an hour like I do on my podcast to get into, just to scratch the issues. And I realized I'd been quite sort of dismissive, actually. And that in a way, there's things you can always learn. And sometimes it's not the older experienced person that you learn from, it's the younger, you know, upstart, you know. And my son has now ridiculously taken me over on TikTok. He's got like 1.7 million followers, but it's because he's good at doing what he does. And for me, you know, that was a good lesson learned, that you're never too old to learn from someone who's literally maybe just started something but gets it and actually, you know, and then you're, you know, there's always room to learn. So it's not always the more experienced person coming in and thinking they know how to do it. It's the person who's got the drive and the gumption and is, you know, really breaking new ground that we can learn from as well.
Yeah, I love that. That's so powerful. What great testimony as well. And as we kind of journey through stuff, it is so easy for us to think about the older and wiser ones imparting their wisdom, Yoda-like wisdom, into the young Jedis that are coming through next. But the truth is, you're right. It's harnessing the passion of those people around us and journeying together in community and pulling from all the different resources of the community to help one another grow. And as well, sometimes I think we put an immense amount of pressure on ourselves to kind of save the world with one TikTok video or save the world with one YouTube song or one interview. I remember as a teenager, when Delirious was starting to get quite well known and they started to have a few little appearances on TV. I was an older teenager, probably about 17 at the time, and I was quite excited about them going on Saturday morning TV because I was thinking, oh yeah,
I remember that. Was that on like whatever I can't remember the name of it, but yeah, they appeared on one of those. Was it Live and Kicking? Yeah, I think something like that. Yeah,
something like that. And they went,
and we were all like, oh wow, this is the big thing. They're about to break.
Totally, yeah. And I remember them getting a lot of stick for not just preaching the gospel on Saturday morning TV. And even then, as a young man, I remember that sitting quite uncomfortably. I was very passionate about my faith, very passionate about talking about Jesus, but it sat uncomfortably with me that we'd put this expectation on Delirious to try and save the world in one interview. And I just remember saying to my friends who were all disappointed at the time, like, lads, we have no idea the conversations they're having behind the scenes, the influence that they're having that could immediately disappear if they go. So it's always finding that tension, isn't it, between not trying to save the world in one interview, but at the same time not using that as an excuse to shirk the intentionality that God is ushering you into. And it's always about asking, why do I have this opportunity? Why is God giving it to me when He could give it to anybody?
And that, I mean, and a lot of that feels like, you know, it's relevant to the Unbelievable show, because sometimes I feel like if it had been more of a kind of wham, bam, here's the gospel, it has to be preached on every show, and you've got to make sure that Christian leaves knowing exactly what the claims of Christianity are. well, then I wouldn't have been able to bring on a lot of the guests that I have actually been able to bring on, because they think, oh, that's that kind of preachy show where, you know, you go in and get, by the end of it, they have to give given you, you know, the ways in which you can be saved. And I think it's because I've cultivated a show where there's an openness, but we don't hide, you know, that this has a Christian foundation, and that ultimately, you know, we believe that Christianity is intellectually defensible and changes lives. But at the same time, it doesn't sort of force that on someone, so that they can come in and be who they are and not feel like, you know, I'm being basically stood up as the heretic in this sort of situation. So, you know, we're going to be having Richard Dawkins opposite Francis Collins on our next edition of The Big Conversation, and I don't feel like I could have got a Richard Dawkins in on the show if the example that had been set up to that point had been basically of kind of shouting down, or kind of, you know, having to correct all the time, you know, the people who come from his perspective. Hopefully it's something to do with the fact that you felt, okay, yeah, this is a show where I'm going to be, you know, respected and you know, and have a genuine dialogue with the other person. So there you go. That's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's great. If we could sum it up in one sentence, it would be trusting God in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We landed it early. It's good. Justin, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks so much for giving us your time.
Been an absolute
and your
pleasure.
Insight.
Thank you.
It's a joy to have you. Please do go check out the Unbelievable podcast and radio show. Links in the description below. Do go and get yourself a ticket. Saturday, 14th of May. You can attend in person, which I'm sure is an experience not to be missed. Or if you can't get yourself down to London, then you can do the online version as well. And do keep checking in with the Unbelievable site, because there's going to be a whole raft of new resources and podcasts and amazing training available for you, for your church community. Do get involved. And of course, why not pick up a copy of Justin's book to read between now and then? Justin, thanks again.
Thanks, Ben.
Bless you. And to all of you who've been listening, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of these great conversations, and we will see you next time.